For nearly 4,000 years, the land of Israel has been the homeland of the Jewish people. It's always been our home. It will always be our home.
I reported this last fall when Nide said, our own kids don't like what's going on, Jewish kids. Yeah, they don't like a genocide. They don't like utter silence when sort of small Holocaust is going on and being paid for by the American people, underwritten by the American people. Gosh, they don't like that. And there is just this tide of blood, of Palestinian blood, that is under all this Israel lobby bullshit. And it breaks out in such moments as Nide saying that Kamala Harris can somehow repackage pro-Israel for our kids. I don't think it's going to happen.
This is the Mondoweiss podcast, and I'm Khadr Jabbar. On today's episode, our U.S. correspondent Michael Arria talks with Mondoweiss founder and senior editor Phil Weiss about Kamala Harris's Israel and Palestine record, Netanyahu's address to Congress, and how activism is shifting national discussion on Palestine.
So, Phil, a lot has happened in the last couple of weeks, obviously, in U.S. politics. And the other day, we had this historic announcement that a lot of people saw coming. Joe Biden drops out of the 2024 presidential race, endorses Kamala Harris, the vice president. Pretty much virtually every Democratic lawmaker in the country endorses her quickly. A couple of holdouts, notably Rashida Tlaib. Maybe we'll talk about that later. I wanted to start maybe by, we had this discussion before we jumped on about whether or not there's some room here for things to change. This terrible, genocidal assault on Gaza that's been occurring for 10 months now. I don't think that either of us believe there's much in the way of Harris that, insofar as we really see a definitive shift on this issue or within the context of U.S. foreign policy more broadly. I should just quickly kind of run down. I mean, people probably know this, but she obviously does not have the kind of long record that Biden does on this issue or any issue because, he's been in Congress for many decades and has run for president many times. So, a shorter sample size, as they say in baseball. But she's a staunch supporter of Israel, has been for years. She addressed AIPAC in 2017. She bragged at that conference about how the first resolution she co-sponsored as senator was aimed at combating, quote, anti-Israel bias at the United Nations. She gave an off-the-record speech to AIPAC in 2018, which ended up getting reported by The Intercept and other places. So the text of that was eventually leaked. In that speech, she claimed that she raised money for the Jewish National Fund as a Girl Scout, which seems kind of dubious, but maybe she did. She said, years later, she said, having grown up in the Bay Area, I fondly remember those Jewish National Fund boxes that we would use to collect donations to plant trees for Israel. Years later, when I visited Israel for the first time, I saw the fruits of that effort and the Israeli ingenuity that has truly made a desert bloom. She was praised by Democratic Majority for Israel, DMFI, a lobbying group that we cover at the site a lot, in 2019 when she ran for president because she made comments effectively suggesting that her policy in Iran would be to the right of the Obama administration. She didn't exactly criticize the nuclear deal that the Obama administration developed, but she did say that she would strengthen it. She wanted to extend sunset provisions, including ballistic missile testing. She wanted to increase oversight. So DMFI was very, very happy with that. She's condemned the BDS movement, as most Democratic politicians do. But we should point out that she's voted against attempts to put that into law. She voted against an anti-BDS bill in 2019, citing First Amendment concerns, as most Democrats do. And shifting to the war in Gaza, since October 7th, she's obviously said all the same stuff that the administration has said. Hamas, brutal terrorist organization. Israel needs the right to exist, security. No nation could possibly live in such danger. She hosted a screening of the Sheryl Sandberg documentary "Screams Before Silence" in June, a documentary that's been heavily criticized for relying on information from the Israeli group Zaka. And I guess beyond that, I would just say there are some people have been citing these a lot in recent days, but kind of small people detect some maybe small differences. And I'll just quickly run down some of those. I mean, in March, she had called for a 6-week temporary ceasefire. She was the first member of the administration to mention such a move, which they semi-walked back and then kind of embraced. It's always been murky to my mind when it comes to this kind of stuff. There's been a lot of State Department, as you know, a lot of State Department spokespeople kind of contradicting things that Blinken said about investigations. And this was kind of no different. The overall position from the administration seemed kind of murky. Obviously, there's been no ceasefire, temporary or otherwise, so it didn't add up to anything. She's repeatedly called on the Israeli government to do more to ensure the delivery of humanitarian aid, which just seems kind of basic. There was a recent interview that she did with Joan Walsh at The Nation, where she expressed some sympathy for campus protesters who have been, setting up encampments in solidarity with Gaza. She did say she didn't wholesale endorse their points, but said something like that they're, showing human emotion, that she kind of related to it, that she understood why they were doing what they did. And the foreign policy team around her is kind of viewed by some people as a little more, I guess I hesitate to use the word progressive, but a little less hawkish than the team around Biden. Her national security advisor is Phil Gordon, one of the people in the Obama administration who pushed the Iran deal. There was a piece in Jewish Insider last year where the CEO of Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which is a neocon group, said that Gordon was very much of the progressive wing of the national security state, connected him directly to Obama. So I guess I'll throw it over to you. Having said all that, do you think there is any shift here if Harris, in terms of Harris and the foreign policy that we've seen from Biden on this issue since?
Well, obviously, thanks, Michael. That was a great summary. I think that, and obviously everyone is asking this question right now. And it does remind me of, I guess my bottom line on this is it does remind me a little bit of the Obama moment when people said, oh, a person of color is going to be president. Who cares about Palestinians? And people on the left had some degree of optimism about him shifting policy. And I guess in the end, it's no different in that sense. This policy is not going to be determined by an individual. This policy is determined by, well, I think principally by a faction, the Israel lobby, but critically other factors in the United States, foreign policy establishment play a role. And there won't be much change. That being said, there is, as you have chronicled, right now, there is a genocide, and there is a critical awareness of that genocide inside the Democratic Party. There was a poll that we cite often on the site that in May or so, or April, 56 to 22% Democrats, by 56 to 22, said it is a genocide, it's not a genocide. That's rank and file Democrats. The Democratic Party, anyone with a conscience, any decent person in this country is appalled by the bloodbath and the horrors that Netanyahu and the Israeli government, not just Netanyahu, have unleashed on the Palestinians. And it's causing enormous disturbance in American politics. Obama's line used to be, you know how I feel. You've convinced me, he took the old FDR line about shifting policy. This was rumored, or I think he may actually have said it at one point. That old line about you meet with an activist, a president meets with someone who cares about an issue and says, you've convinced me, that's great. Now go out and convince the public. Then I can change policy. And I think that's what we're critically is happening right now, is that I think all these people, Biden, Obama, Harris, maybe Trump too, I think they kind of I think they dislike to hate Israel. Israel is a pariah state. It is an apartheid state. It is a racist, Jewish supremacist state. Everyone knows that, and we're stuck with it. It's our supremacist state, and we're so giving them endless weapons to conduct a genocide. I think that politicians hate having to deal with Israel, and that yet they have to deal with it. And the issue is that will you change? Will the public change enough that I can change? Will public opinion change enough that I, as president, can change? And that seems to me the sort of opening. That's where I see a little optimism. I'm a little bit optimistic. Yesterday, Tom Nides, the former ambassador to Israel, a giant cheerleader for Israel from the Minnesota Jewish community, was asked, he knows Biden and Harris better than anyone. He's been on hundreds of phone calls with Harris. And he was asked, is there any daylight, the critical question, is there any daylight between Biden and Harris on Israel? And his answer was zilch, zero, zippo. So I take him at his word. I don't think the policy is going to change. The policy statements are not going to change at all in the next few months. And Harris and the party are extremely worried that this issue, this possible daylight question, is going to come up. Well, it will come up. They're going to answer that by, as Douglas Emhoff, the second gentleman, Harris's husband, said on that same call to the Jewish Democratic Council of America, he said she has been and will always be a staunch supporter of Israel as a secure, democratic, and Jewish state, and will always ensure that Israel can defend itself. So that's who Kamala Harris is, he said. Okay, I mean, that's typical bullshit about, a politician. Who is a politician? But I'm sorry I've been so long-winded. I think that she will do everything not to give not to disquiet the Democratic Party elites over the next few weeks. And yet she will also have to address this growing movement on the left that sees the genocide and will not, it sees it as a sort of Holocaust that they're not going to shut up about it, as we saw from the remarkable number of Democrats who boycotted the speech, and from Rashida Tlaib's beautiful resistance to the speech, and from the demonstrators. End of long answer.
Yeah, no, that was great. I would, echo what you said. I think it's important to point out here, insofar as anything changes in terms of American foreign policy or domestic policy, for that matter, the definitive factor, obviously, both parties are not exactly the same when it comes to many issues, particularly domestic. But the definitive factor with a lot of this stuff is often, obviously, what is happening among the American people, what's happening in the streets. And to your point, we had all this, robust anti-war energy, millions of people protesting during Iraq, and then the Obama campaign kind of swallowed that all up. There was virtually nothing on that scale, even close. We basically set up, the largest, I think Noam Chomsky once referred to it as the largest assassination campaign in human history.
Wow.
More troops in Afghanistan,
Wow.
never closed Gitmo, et cetera. And, you really didn't see any more protests even about Afghanistan, even though that war continued and didn't end until the Biden administration. That is not the situation this time. There's a Democrat in the White House, and we've seen the biggest anti-war protests that we've, witnessed in over 20 years. And to your point, I think
that's great.
That inevitably changes, the discourse, and also what's possible, and also the way in which lawmakers are tipping. You mentioned the uncommitted movement. They got over 500,000 votes in through the Democratic primaries. This is the Democratic base. You know what I mean? These are people who vote in Democratic primaries.
Yeah.
And these people were sending Biden a strong message that, you reject your policy on Gaza. And now that group, uncommitted movement, which, started in Michigan with virtually nothing in the way of money resources, is going to have a number of delegates at the upcoming Democratic National Convention next month.
That's beautiful.
And they announced Monday night, we should point out, this new campaign, Not Another Bomb, which is a 4-week push calling on leaders at every level of this government to embrace an arms embargo against Israel. And they have a petition that they're circulating that's addressed to Harris directly. So that is that is different, to your point. Like we didn't, people who've been following this issue for a long time, it's kind of hard to envision, something like that happening 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, delegates, people able to engage directly with politicians and kind of changing the discourse. Because we know that one of the reasons why Biden was kind of already vulnerable, the poll that came out right before he dropped out with the terrible numbers from Michigan, we've been reporting for a long time on some of those surveys that, James Zogby and others have done that show among the Arab American population there in a popular swing state, Biden's, popularity has dipped incredibly. The numbers are just staggering and have been for quite a while. So, that's obviously an important part of this story. I think we're going to see, we're going to keep seeing protests, and we're obviously going to see them next month at the DNC. And I do wonder if some of that starts to shift. It was interesting. I don't want to maybe we won't get on Netanyahu now, but what did you make of? To me, it was kind of indicative of the administration policy or Harris's, attempt. She really has to kind of like straddle a line on this, right? Because the Democratic base doesn't want this assault.
Right.
They don't support Israel anymore. They're more sympathetic towards Palestinians, but at the same time, the Democratic establishment and the vast majority of Democrats, are still very pro-Israel. And, you're running against a Republican Party, which is already, claiming that she's anti-Israel, that she's anti-Semitic, despite being married to a Jewish person. So I thought it was quite telling that she skipped the Netanyahu speech, but then she is going to meet him. So she's like skipping the public spectacle, but she is going to meet him behind closed doors. I thought it's about their relationship. Yeah.
So, Michael, in response, I have a question for you that relates to that. But to answer your question, I think that it is all these things, the kabuki of our positioning here is going to be everyone's watching it. Everyone's fascinated by it. And the Jewish Democratic Council of America, the leading actual Democratic Party organization that's for Israel and that supposedly represents Jewish people, is extremely worried about this. And on their webinar yesterday, they not only had Doug Emhoff, Kamala Harris's husband, to reassure us that she's pro-Israel, but they and Nides, who offered that Zippo Zero Zilch analysis, but there was just tremendous anxiety about whether she would move at all, and they were the thing I found interesting. One interesting thing I heard was when Nides said that she is going to reposition Israel for the next 20 years. So we think about new ways that we're going to support Israel for the next generation. So they are embracing this sort of generational shift, the Israel lobby, by saying she's going to put a new face on it. There will be the same old shit in a brand new bag is really the way they are looking at this. And the question is whether they're going to be able to get away with it. And I think that the Michigan point you raised is that, if you're going to move 100,000 or 200,000 voters in Michigan, or 20,000, which is critical, you got to give them something. And so I think that'll be fascinating to watch. But I think it's important to consider the achievements of this movement already, as you pointed out, and the uncommitted movement. And let's look at that. Yesterday they had a call, and you're a better nose counter than I am, but I feel that they are getting some people on their side. Not another bomb. They're getting some people who we might not have expected. And the reason they're showing up is that they know that the Democratic base hates this. Yesterday on MSNBC, Dana Bash, a big supporter of Israel, reflexive supporter of Israel, said to Jerry Nadler from New York, well, Rashida Tlaib was holding up a sign saying, "You're committing genocide. You're a war criminal," on the floor of the House. She said it in, as if this was a moral outrage that Rashida Tlaib was standing up against a genocide. And I found it fascinating that Nadler, rather than echoing the outrage at all, said she is representing her constituents. And I found it really moving as a partly as a Jewish guy to watch that, to see a guy who's been so supportive of Israel and whose district is heavily Jewish standing up a little bit for Rashida Tlaib on that, or not smearing Rashida. And I think he sees the ground shifting. I think Nadler, who has always said, when am I going to get asked to press, or the question, Nadler sees his own base shifting, and he's afraid. So I started to ask you the nose counter question. Do you see any shift in the actual politicians in the Congress?
That's an interesting question because, of course, they just lost Jamal Bowman in Congress, partially because of the amount of money that AIPAC spent. I'm sure we'll get into AIPAC at some point during this conversation. Just to follow up on Nadler, he also, I think I sent this to you, but he was interviewed by MSNBC yesterday and said that he blatantly said he expects Kamala Harris to be less supportive of Israel than Biden. And he attributed it to the younger elements of the party. I guess to your nose counter question, I'd say that press conference yesterday that you're referring to, just go down the line there. You have Cori Bush, who's been good on this issue since she came into Congress. Of course, there's a reason why AIPAC is spending millions of dollars to oust her, and they might be successful in a couple of weeks. You have Ayanna Pressley, who kind of led this press conference. This is somebody who, when she came into Congress, I would say, I don't think it's controversial to say in many ways she was the least progressive member of what's referred to as the squad. She backed Elizabeth Warren, where AOC, Omar, and Tlaib backed Bernie. We've covered this on the site. People can go back into our archives. I would encourage them to, because we have some really great pieces from activists in her state of Massachusetts. But she backed that anti-BDS bill that we covered a lot at the time. This is going back, 3 or 4 years ago now.
Which says that BDS is anti-Semitic.
Says that BDS is anti-Semitic, condemns it as anti-Semitic movement. This was opposed by a number of progressive politicians, obviously politicians like Tlaib. It was supported by Ayanna Pressley, I believe the only member of the squad to support it, put out a statement saying that she sympathizes with Palestinians, but she had a responsibility to her Jewish constituents to vote for that bill, right? She was criticized heavily, and I've spoken to activists in Boston who have talked about the activism that specifically targeted her after that vote. They engaged with her office, and since then she voted against Iron Dome. She's been, so it's like, and now she's leading this press conference where you're talking about not another bomb. Greg Cesar was on that press conference yesterday. People can look him up. That's another thing we've covered on the site. He kind of, in many ways, he got de-endorsed or whatever, unendorsed, I don't know what the correct terminology is, by DSA when he ran for Congress, because he basically flipped his position on Israel, became much more pro-Israel in his public statements. And now he's on this call. And also on this call, a number, I think more than one person who resigned from, you have Lily Greenberg Call, Tariq Abash, former Biden administration officials who have quit the Biden administration over the policy, something that you never saw during, the worst war crimes of the Obama administration. So yeah, to answer your question, I think there has been, right? I mean, wouldn't you agree? There, insofar as we can document this stuff, it definitely seems to be slowly shifting.
Yeah, I think there's a real shift. Yeah, I mean, and just I want to fasten on a couple of your points. You were the one who said that these resignations are significant. There have been a dozen resignations publicly, and I wrote about this the other day. And they say there've been a lot more. The people who are public say there've been many more, and there's huge disquiet in the administration about this genocidal policy, us giving bombs to a genocide in Gaza. And I think that, as you pointed out, it means so much when people resign. And a lot of these people, they resigned in May and July, earlier this month. So these things, they've been upset for months and months, and it just got to be too much. And I think that we didn't see that in other critical moments of American history in the last 25 years. And I think in the Vietnam era, there were a number of resignations, but I think it's huge. And I go back to, and then I want to respond to a couple of other points you made before. I think we should segue to Netanyahu, but I think it's very interesting, apropos of the Jewish community, that even the Jewish community, which is reactionary by and large on the Israel question, and is the reason I believe that the Democratic Party is reactionary, is because this huge traditional part of the coalition, the Jewish community, which is there as voters and as donors, the Jewish community is right-wing on Israel. The Jewish community is even shifting. And I mean, the politicians are aware of that. And the Jewish community is in some degree of flux here. And if not now, is providing a voice, communal Jews who call it apartheid and genocide. And of course, Jewish Voice for Peace, which led the fantastic demonstration at the Capitol the other day, the sit-in. They are the absolute leaders on this, anti-Zionist Jews. And Tom Nides, the former ambassador, said in this call yesterday, I can't wait for Harris, he said, because she can go to college campuses and she can go to our own kids. Those of us who are on this call have kids who are giving us grief about what's going on there, meaning what's going on in Gaza. I reported this last fall when Nides said, our own kids don't like what's going on, Jewish kids. Yeah, they don't like a genocide. They don't like utter silence when a sort of small Holocaust is going on and being paid for by the American people, underwritten by the American people. Gosh, they don't like that. And there is just this tide of blood, of Palestinian blood, that is under all this Israel lobby bullshit. And it breaks out in such moments as Nides saying that Kamala Harris can somehow repackage pro-Israel for our kids. I don't think it's going to happen. I mean, I get, obviously you can see I get pretty worked up about this.
Wait, Phil, can I interject real quick before you go on? The funny thing about this is that Harris's stepdaughter publicly raised millions of dollars in the wake of October 7th for the UN Relief Agency for Palestinians. So I just wanted to point that out. It's kind of funny that Nides made that point.
That's great. So that's Emhoff's, and it's Emhoff's biological daughter, not hers.
Right, I believe so, yeah.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of theater on Doug Emhoff only got out to Israel 2017 for the first time. He's a corporate lawyer and, a tool, but he doesn't care that much about Israel. And I'm glad to hear that his daughter took that position. So I mean, there's a lot of flux going on, but they're going to just try to pack it down and be incredible. I mean, look, I think, Michael, we have to admit that, we're dealing with Olympic level gold medal politicians in Biden and Kamala Harris. And she has done a fantastic job from a strictly political standpoint of taking a very chaotic political situation and solidifying her position over the last 4 days. So God knows there are whole rooms of advisors right now figuring out how she's going to message on Israel in such a manner as to try to make a genocide acceptable to the Democratic base.
Right. I wanted to let's do what you suggested and pivot to Netanyahu, who addressed Congress yesterday, joint meeting of Congress. This is the fourth time that the Israeli prime minister has addressed Congress, which is a record. In fact, he's now addressed the U.S. Congress more than any world leader in U.S. history. He was previously tied with Winston Churchill, so he passed Winston Churchill yesterday.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody was surprised by the content of the speech. Defended Israel's assault on Gaza, said that they would keep it up until victory was achieved. Of course, there's no there's no explanation of what that means. It's just, Hamas will be defeated, even though all the news that I'm sure me and you are seeing from that region does not suggest that Hamas is on the verge of being defeated, certainly. Warned of playing all the hits, warned of an alleged nuclear threat from Iran, called on lawmakers to embrace, the relationship between the United States of Israel, and smeared protesters, thousands of people across the world who have stood up to this policy, said that they were Iran's useful idiots.
Yeah.
And this was, we should point out, about half the Democrats did not go to the speech. Some of them, like Tim Kaine and others, this was Harris's reason for not attending either, claimed that they had prior engagements, and I'm sure some of them did. But we've seen that recently in recent years, right? When it comes to the AIPAC conference, when all of a sudden everybody's very busy, but they won't criticize it directly. And then we had people, of course, who said that they weren't attending because of his policy in Gaza. Bernie Sanders said that he shouldn't be welcomed. We saw Cori Bush say the same. Invoked the arms embargo that I mentioned. She was on that call the same day. Summer Lee gave a great speech on the House floor where she said this body will be ashamed of its actions one day.
Wow.
Allowing this man in.
Great.
Thomas Massey, who obviously very right wing, but is takes a position on this issue where he believes Netanyahu is just trying to bolster his political standing, and he felt like the whole thing was just, he didn't want to be a prop, I think was his words. And then you already mentioned this, but Tlaib went to the speech and held up a sign, one side of which said guilty of genocide, the other side of which said war criminal. And this has been underreported, but it was also stated that over 100 congressional interns coordinated a sick out. They all called in sick and did not attend, put out a statement that said they call on all members of Congress to boycott the address and take a unified stand against what we believe is a universal evil. So this is the response to Netanyahu.
Beautiful.
2015, which was the big, coming to Congress to it's a surreal moment, addressing Congress to argue against the then administration's policy towards a foreign country in Iran and trying to, destroy any hopes of a Iran deal, was unsuccessful in destroying that. But Trump, of course, finished it off. But there was a big deal made about the amount of Democrats that boycotted that speech. And somebody pointed out online, about 50 Democrats boycotted that speech. Yesterday, it was 136 Democrats. And it certainly wasn't anybody.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So that has shifted. Having said all that, every line was virtually every line was greeted by a standing ovation. But, a lot of Democrats who have been quite pro-Israel. John Fetterman even put on a suit, blue tie to clap. Manchin, other people that we've talked about. Nadler, you mentioned. I mean, like somebody like that is also. I think his response is indicative of something. He said, I think he said something like Netanyahu is the worst leader in the history of Israel, going back 2,000 years, but that he was going to attend the address for respect to the state. It's just like the hoops that I don't know people jump through in order to kind of like feign some sort of moral consistency are quite striking. But a sick spectacle, and a lot of people online put up little videos where they're showing the applause and kind of contrast them with these terrible scenes of people holding their dead children or buildings blowing up.
As they should be.
Yeah. So I think I know what your impressions are, but just impressions of yesterday. Anything stand out?
I have different impressions. I'm going to surprise you,
okay,
Michael.
I'm ready.
Okay. Well, first of all, I need to cue you because you know better, have more information at your fingertips. But J.D. Vance was not there, the vice presidential candidate for the Republican Party. He made a similar claim that, he also said I was scheduled somewhere else. And the Democrats are scrambling today saying, Kamala Harris shouldn't have done political theater. That was political theater. We want her to have a substantive meeting with Netanyahu, as she will later today. Okay. I think the big tell on this, to me, I think it was a sick speech. I don't think it was the same old Netanyahu. It was the same old Netanyahu, but he took the L out of slick, and it was just sick. It was just, I found it to be filled with hatred, I found it such a disgusting speech. The attack on American protesters, repulsive. And that surely offended a lot of Americans, and it should offend a lot of Americans. Attacking our constitutional right to free speech in the manner that he did, and just the indifference to Palestinian suffering is sick. I mean, just the sickness. Use the word sick. I just found it such. I think it was repellent in a way that the 2015 speech was not. And I think the big tell here was Pelosi. What did Pelosi say? You know,
she said Pelosi. It was she after the fact said it was the worst speech I think that anyone's ever given to Congress. Was her
okay? And I take that. I know you shouldn't take politicians at face value. I take her a little bit of face value on that. I think that it was such an appalling. It just makes me vomit to think about him and what he said, and just the indifference to Palestinians. And I think that point really is overriding even underneath the media response, because we are a country that, in our imperial atrocities and misadventures, and for all the slaughter that we have done, there's always been this, we have to win hearts and minds. What are we doing to win hearts and minds in the Arab world? That comes up after the slaughter, okay? And just the indifference to, just the utter indifference to hearts and minds. And the clear, I just found it, I was just overwhelmed, as I've made clear. But to go to Pelosi, why I think that's such a tell.
Yeah, we should quickly. Do you want me to quickly? I have.
Yeah, sure.
Pelosi said, she tweeted, Benjamin Netanyahu's presentation. This is Nancy Pelosi, long-time staunch supporter of Israel. Yeah. Benjamin Netanyahu's presentation in the House chamber today was by far the worst presentation of any foreign dignitary invited and honored with the privilege of addressing the Congress of the United States. Many of us who love Israel spent time listening to Israeli citizens whose families have suffered in the wake of October 7th Hamas terror attack and kidnappings. These families are asking for a ceasefire deal that will bring the hostages home, and we hope the Prime Minister would spend his time achieving that goal.
Okay. So that's a very interesting statement. Thank you for reading it. I have two comments on it, because I want to segue from Netanyahu to the liberal Zionist Israel lobby, which I think is actually going to have a role finally. And the first point I think that must be made about Pelosi is, this is a person who said in 2019, she was pissing all over the Squad in 2019. People were saying, what should we be worried about the Squad? And she was saying to a pro-Israel group in early 2019, she said, basically, ignore those people. They're just a splinter group. She said, this capital will crumble and fall before we abandon our relationship with Israel, our cooperation with Israel. Okay. She's not saying that they're abandoning Israel. She's saying it's Netanyahu that she hates in this statement. Nonetheless, she didn't go to the speech, and the capital didn't crumble and fall. And I think that what is fascinating about, or what is not fascinating, but certainly interesting about Pelosi's positioning and J Street's positioning, the liberal Zionist lobby, is that they're all saying Netanyahu is hateful. Netanyahu is hateful. P.S. Israel is hateful. Israel is a state that says the exclusive right of self-determination belongs to Jews. It's explicitly an apartheid racist state. Okay. And it's not a democratic state. And that is news to these Pelosi and Kamala Harris and all the Douglas Emhoffs of the world. Nonetheless, they have taken this safe position now that it's Netanyahu's the problem. And I think it's kind of fascinating that that's an anti-Netanyahu position that they've been fleshing out for a long time, but now it's very full-throated. And that's going to be their safe zone, I think, through this campaign, is we hate Netanyahu. We love Israel. We hate Netanyahu. Netanyahu is the problem.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm wondering kind of what your I mean, do we know why Netanyahu came to, obviously, but do you see anything? And we should put out, we haven't pointed this out, that in addition to, Congress, the bigger story really is how much protest he was. Thousands of people on the streets. You mentioned the Jewish Voice for Peace sit-in the night before, where I think over 300 people were arrested, but
Wow.
tens of thousands of people in the streets. They said his motorcade had to take an alternate route because they had blocked.
Wow. Beautiful.
And many on the street calling, of course, for his arrest, because now the ICC is seeking a warrant, which they say could be coming within the next couple of weeks.
Wow.
Charged
Beautiful.
war crimes. Do you? Sorry, go on.
And I'm sorry to break in there, but who was the politician who said, I personally would serve the warrant? Pocan on that call.
Right.
He said, I personally would serve the warrant to Netanyahu, for as a war criminal. So this is just to finish up my point, sort of. I think that's what we're seeing right now, is that they are going to run. Kamala Harris is going to run against Trump and Netanyahu. And that's the way she is going to try to cover herself with Detroit and the progressive base. Is she's going to say, I hate Netanyahu. And she feels safe politically doing so, which is fascinating. She feels that she is not going to alienate the Tom Nides and the Israel lobby. She's gotten a green light from the Israel lobby. You can bash Netanyahu. Israel hates Netanyahu. You can hate Netanyahu. And that's her lane. I should have said that. That's why I should have figured that out at the start of our call. I'm sorry, Michael.
No, it's fine. And that is actually, I'm glad you said that, because my question was going to be if you thought that the Netanyahu speech kind of changed anything in the context of, I guess we'll see today, right? Because we have Harris and Biden meeting with him, and we'll be interested to see kind of what comes out of that, what statements are made. I agree with you. Yeah, go on.
Could I ask you, how much do you think politicians care about, you mentioned the tens of thousands of demonstrators. You mentioned the anti-war demonstrations that we haven't seen in 20 years on this scale. How much do politicians care about that?
I think that some
I ask with good faith.
I think that some do care quite a bit, but the question, of course, is whether or not them caring actually translates to a shift in policy. That's a different question. I remember, of course, you've probably heard this too, that towards the end of his life, Lyndon Johnson still was, being woken up by nightmares, kids chanting LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?
Wow.
But of course, he didn't change his policy in Vietnam. So it's like, I'm sure some people are struck by it, but I do think, we have seen that pressure consistently. We've seen it work on kind of Democrats who have been on the fence on certain things. And, it's a testament to, there's a lot of people who show up every day and do this work. We've shared many videos and stuff. People, congressional offices, just, consistent. For the last 10 months, we've seen consistent protest and agitation. And I do think it changes the zeitgeist, so to speak, and the contours of kind of what's possible in that dimension. But my question was going to be if you thought Netanyahu changed the election. We can kind of wrap it up here, but I think you kind of answered it already. I agree with you. I think the Harris line is going to be similar to I think Bernie does this a lot too. Netanyahu's Israel, right? This distinction between Israel and Netanyahu's Israel. Yeah. This idea that he's kind of bad for the brand, not just because of the genocide, but also because of the judicial overhaul stuff. That this guy is their version of Trump, and that he's trampling all over Israeli democracy, which is a good thing. And we need Israel there. We support it for all this time. It's becoming a harder sell because of this guy. And I think I agree with you. I think that's how she's.
Yeah. I have a question for you to wrap it up, but I just want to observe in that connection.
Yeah.
I'm at my mother's house in Philadelphia, and as I've written, she's a big Israel supporter. She gets all the propaganda from American Jewish Committee, ADL, AIPAC. It all floods into this house. When my mother is a little bit infirm now, so when I get the phone call, I say, stop funding genocide and hang up on them. Anyway, but to your point, she watched the speech with me yesterday and she said, I don't like that Netanyahu.
Oh, wow.
So that's a safe place, I think, for in terms of the Israel law. But my question to you to wrap this up is the sort of bottom line question. Let's say Kamala Harris is inaugurated in January of 2025.
Sure.
Do you think policy on Israel will change?
I think it'll be dependent on what happens I think there are things unconnected to Harris's view of the situation. To kind of echo the last thing I said, I think a lot of this will depend on what happens in the region in terms of Israel and in terms of the Palestinian resistance there. And I also think what happens in the election is obviously important beyond the president, like who ends up controlling the Senate, who ends up controlling the House. Do we see an expansion of the so-called Squad? We've lost Bowman. We might lose Bush in a couple weeks. But are there gains in other areas where this kind of? But I will say this, and this will be a good way to wrap it up. And I guess after I say this, we can throw it back to you and see if you agree, and then we can call it a day. But I am of the opinion, and I said this to you the other day, there is a perception, I think, for many people who follow this issue and many people on the left that it doesn't really matter who the president is. Everybody's really bad on Israel. And of course, that is true and has been true for quite a while. Having said that, I believe, we see all these tributes to Biden pouring in about how he's such a great, selfless man. And, he had such a great presidency and he's a great American for stepping down. I believe that the Biden policy, as it relates to Gaza, has been uniquely bad in a variety of ways. And if you're listening to this podcast, you probably have many examples that you can cite. I won't run through the details on them, but whether it's, George H.W. Bush with the loans or the Reagan stuff after the massacre in Lebanon, even during the Biden administration, people can go back to the Forward book. I know we reported this on the site. The book that Franklin Forward wrote about the Biden time in the White House, where he talked about the 2021 assault on Gaza, where Netanyahu is pummeling Gaza yet again, and Biden gets on the phone with him, and as it's reported, basically says something to the effect of let's wrap this up. I think we're off the runway. I forget the exact terminology, but I think you remember he says something like this to Netanyahu.
Yeah,
and it's basically reported that Netanyahu begrudgingly agrees that he's going to wrap it up, and it's moments like this say something profound about the relationship between the United States and Israel. And I do believe that it's possible, if there was another generic Democrat in the White House, that there might be not an impressive foreign policy. I don't think they're going to, embrace a Palestinian state or, really stand up to Netanyahu or embrace an arms embargo. But I do think, to the extent that we've seen it before with Obama, Biden a few years ago, like I mentioned, George H.W. Bush, Reagan, that we might see a couple red lines more than just the president saying, I'm going to temporarily hold up a weapon shipment and then back down on it 2 months later, which is pretty much the only thing we've seen, which Republicans freaked out about, but never added up to anything. Everything that Netanyahu has wanted for this war, Biden has got for him. He's supported it. We've seen these, public expressions of frustration and I had a call with, it's leaked. Biden had a call with Netanyahu. He was very upset. He was frustrated. Nothing in the way of policy. Absolutely nothing. Been terrible on this issue. And I think, like LBJ, who he referenced, it will be his legacy. None of the domestic stuff will be remembered in the same way. It'll be his legacy. This terrible, genocide that's being, continued against the Palestinian people. So to end, I will throw it back to you. Do you kind of agree with that a different Democrat might be slightly different on the issue, or do you think we're going to see?
I do.
The same?
I do. Although it is a stylistic question, somewhat. If you're still loving Israel, the two observations I have from what you said are: in 2021, Biden gave that ultimatum to Netanyahu, I think, in large part because Rashida Tlaib said, they are murdering my people.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
She corralled him on the tarmac at the Detroit airport. And ever since then, they've made sure that she doesn't get anywhere, because he is a people person. He's a great retail politician. And that woman is such a force of nature. And she's going to be a great force in our politics. So I'm deeply moved by what she did yesterday. And I think that got out. I want to hear I want to wrap up actually by hearing what you said, something about Tlaib and Harris. That's the dyad that I actually am hopeful about, that Rashida Tlaib, who is such a force politically, I believe is going to play a role. But the one other comment I'd make is that this reminds me a little of when Obama came into office in 2008 and 2009. He was inaugurated, and he said in so many words, "God damn it, Israel, wrap up this cast lead thing before I get into office." So that 3-week assault on Gaza that killed, 1,800 Gazans, that was just obviously, table stakes compared to where we're at now. But he didn't want a genocide on his in his portfolio. And Israel wrapped it up a day before. And I think they might do that they're under that pressure with Harris now. Like, she's going to say to Netanyahu, I'm going to cut you off at the knees if you do anything publicly, when I'm in office. I'm a different breed. But anyway, those are my thoughts. And you did mention that Tlaib thing, her response to Harris. If you could just answer before we go, I would like to hear about that, just because she's such a hero to me.
To Harris, I mean, you're referring to, she put out a statement. She's one of the last holdout or people who have not, Democrats who haven't backed Harris for president.
I see.
Unlike the other squad members immediately came out and backed her. She put out a statement where she basically said she's looking forward to engaging with Harris, but there's a terrible genocide going on, and she's thinking about the needs of her community and the needs of Palestinian people, and she wants to engage on those issues and other issues, but that she wants a process where I think she asked for an open convention, which seemingly is not really going to happen. But it's important because now, I guess, to just wrap it up, it seems like the time to strike, so to speak, is now. There's a lot when we go into elections. There's a lot of everybody criticize the Democrat. This will lead to Bush. This will lead to Trump. But you can it's very easy to make the opposite argument, which is that the time to ask for things and concessions and to push a candidate in a certain direction is precisely the time when they're trying to win votes, right?
Yes.
And if over 500,000 people went to the polls and just specifically got out of, left their house and went into the polls to vote and sent Biden a message that they're committed, you'd believe, I mean, it's the Democrats, so who knows? But you'd believe that they might be interested in those people and courting those people in some context. They have a long track record of doing the opposite when it comes to this regard, especially the left. But it would strike me now. Tlaib's statement was quite refreshing, because it's like, wow, here's a Democratic politician actually asking for something. Yeah, actually asking for, demanding something for her community in exchange for a potential endorsement.
Wow,
you just don't see that anymore. So to your point,
I love it.
She's a force. Okay. Well, I think that about does it. We've been chatting for about an hour. So.
Oh gosh, yeah. Let's wrap it up. Michael, thanks so much for your reporting. I've learned a lot from it. It's great.
Same to you, Phil. Thank you. Thanks for everything you do. All right, take it easy.
Great.
Bye.
Okay.
That's our show. Mondoweiss is a non-profit publication with no paywalls. If you would like to support our work, please go to mondoweiss.net/donate. Please leave a rating and review to help other listeners find the show. Subscribe to one of our free email newsletters so you can stay up to date on events in Palestine and related politics here in the US and around the world. Finally, if you have any more feedback, send me an email at dave@mondoweiss.net. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode.